Hello, everyone. Welcome to our virtual program. My name is Miranda, the educator at Rome Historical Society. Thank you so much for tuning in. Just really quick off the bat, if you are interested in other programming at Rome Historical Society, you can go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/RomeHistorical, or you can go to our website, romehistoricalsociety.org. And over on those two places, we have our upcoming program, and you can also donate to Rome Historical Society. So if you want, take a chance and go over there and check out what we've got for you to see. Today, we have Bob Allers here with us. He's returning to our virtual program series. So in February, you were here, you did a coopering program, and you can view that on our Facebook page if you missed it. But today, Bob is here to talk about the natural history of the Rome area. So thousands of years ago, there was a large glacier covering the area, and we know that because geologists like Bob examined some of the evidence that's right here in our landscape. So Bob, you're here to talk us through the natural history and specifically about how LiDAR images have uncovered some new evidence, right?
I want to take a look at some of the older work that was done and then look at it in new light of the new technology of LiDAR.
Great. Well, without further ado, we can get started on your presentation, and I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks, Miranda, and thanks, folks, for joining us. Taking a look at the upper Mohawk Valley region, on the western edge of the Mohawk Valley, where Rome is located. And we're going to splash over into parts of a good chunk of Oneida County, a little tiny bit of Madison County, and a little bit of Herkimer County, because the geology doesn't end at the county boundaries. It doesn't end at the state line. It's ubiquitous throughout the entire area. And there's a lot of evidence of the glaciation in this area. We take a look at our first slide. Let's look at some of the early work that was done. And one of the outstanding geologists of the early 20th century was H.L. Fairchild, one of the New York State geologists. And he went out on horseback, Model T, by train, traveled all across New York State, did some incredible field work, and came up with a series of maps describing what he interpreted the glacial geology of New York State was. And this was his earliest maps came out in 1909. So it's been over 110 years since these maps came out, and they're still extremely accurate. This first one shows the maximum extent of the ice here in New York State. You can see right down here in the southwestern part of the state, the Salamanca reentrant, which is the only part of New York State that has no evidence of glaciation. The major extent of the ice went down south of New York City, ended out at Long Island, and that occurred somewhere between 20 and 33,000 years ago. As the ice began to retreat back, and Fairchild saw quite a bit of evidence for this, there was a stand in the Binghamton area. He referred to it as the Binghamton Stage. A few bits of higher land, like the Catskills, were sticking out. There were some Umlaufbergs, little higher areas up here in the Appalachian Plateau that he believes stuck up through the ice. The next retreat of the ice from the Binghamton Stage was farther to the north, forming what Fairchild referred to as the Valley Head Stage. And the deposits, the sediments that were left by the melting ice sheet, formed the heads of the Finger Lake valleys. And this blocked the drainage to the south, so that all of these lakes generally drain toward the north into Lake Ontario and then out through the St. Lawrence. Fairchild thought that the Adirondacks were poking up at about this point, but it looks like they were still covered with ice at the Valley Head Stage. The next stage, The Hudson Lobe moved in from the east, Hudson Mohawk Lobe from the east, and the Ontario and later the Rome Lobe extended in from the west. And in between those, he interpreted that there were a number of glacial lakes, proglacial lakes, meltwater that was trapped between the ice and the Adirondacks to the north and the Appalachian Plateau to the south. Most of the drainage was southward into the Susquehanna drainage system or down through the Hudson. The whole area to the north was blocked by ice, so there was no drainage at the valley head's time to the north and out through the St. Lawrence. The St. Lawrence was completely closed off by ice. Then in the late stages of that Ontario ice lobe, in the area around Lake Ontario, there was a large proglacial lake in the area where modern-day Oneida Lake is, and the outlet of that lake was right here at Rome, down through what they call the Euro-Mohawk, into Glacial Lake Albany, and then out through the Hudson River. So all of the drainage was still out this way, not some of it occurring down through the Susquehanna, but a large amount of it going down through the Hudson and dumping out into the Atlantic. More work that's been done in the 1970s through the 2000s shows us that, yes, he was extremely accurate in his interpretation that Long Island, New York City area was the terminal moraine, the end moraine, the pile of sediment that was left by the ice. That Salamanca and the area here in western New York did not get covered with ice. There was one driftless zone out here in the Midwest, and ice extending through many, many states to the west of us. But we're going to look primarily at New York, and work by some of the authors in the 2000s show a number of glacial lake deposits. And we're going to look at some of those lake deposits. Lake Forestport, Glacial Lake Iroquois, and many others. Using radiocarbon dating in the late 20th century and the early 21st century, geologists were able to put some dates on many of these moraines, the piles of sediment that were left by the ice, and these red areas indicate those moraines. The valley heads were going right across here, and one of the estimates is that based on radiocarbon work, they take a piece of plant, find the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12, and can put an estimate on the age of those sediments or the organic material in those sediments. We find dates running from about 14.6 up to about 12.9, 11.8 thousand years ago. Then with the advent of LiDAR imaging, light detecting and ranging, they fly an airplane over at a relatively low altitude, shoot a laser beam down, in fact, a series of laser beams, a pulse, and you get a number of different returns as that laser beam comes down and strikes first the top of the trees, buildings, and eventually the ground surface, and reflects that laser beam back up to the receiver. By using digital analysis, they can identify the various returns. The first return, typically the top of the trees. The second or third return, the top of the buildings. Fourth return, brush, cars, things like that. And the last return is the ground level. They can color these digital returns, blue being the last one and gray, and the highest ones being reds and yellows. And then using digital analysis, they can remove the upper layers, the fourth, third, second, and first return, and we can look at the ground surface without any vegetation on it. where has this been done in New York State? Well, a lot of the state has been done. The various colors represent the various time periods. These are the areas that are currently existing. You notice northern New York has not been done yet, or northern Oneida County, excuse me. Northern Oneida County, just the northeastern tip of it, has not been covered yet. But the central part of Oneida County, southern part, Madison County, parts of Herkimer County have already been covered. And in the last year, the northern section of Oneida County has been done, but they don't have the digital information up on the New York State Clearinghouse yet. So we're anticipating that, and I can't wait to look at the digital returns from this, because this is the area of the Lansing Kill and the Boonville Gorge and the big meltwater channel that was coming down in the northern and western part of Oneida County. What do these look like? Well, you can get the raw data from the New York State Clearinghouse, look at their ortho imagery, and here we are, the 30-meter LiDAR image. That means that it'll pick up an object to a resolution of about 30 meters. That's about 90 feet, a little less than 100 feet. And here we have the LiDAR image with the highest level on it and the ground level. And this is what it looks like generally in a satellite image with the vegetation on it. If we look at this one on the right, this is without vegetation. Now you may recognize a few things in this image. Here's the Erie Canal, the current Erie Canal. Here it is right here. You can see Route 46 coming up like this. Here's Route 46. But with the vegetation eliminated, you can see the landforms much, much more clearly. We can see these features right here, which are the Rome sand plains. They barely show up with the vegetation. But if you get rid of all that biological stuff, the geology just jumps right out at you. We're going to be looking at another spot down here that's a little bit different. And if you've been looking at any of the images coming back from Mars, this is what you see on the surface of Mars. You see images similar to this, so we can interpret the geologic history. The DEMs, the digital elevation modules or models, come in a set of tiles, and you can download the raw data for these tiles. Then you need some software like ArcGIS to analyze those and to set up a series of graphics, a mosaic that you can merge together. And once you've merged each one of these individual tiles, which you need to download and process, this is a rather time-consuming adventure. But this is what the visual looks like when you merge them all together. It's a little bit to the west of the area of Rome, but here you can see Route 12 coming up out of Utica. This is the area around Deerfield. Here's the canal down here, just a little snippet of it. There's the New York State Thruway. And right over here, this is where Riverside Center is. For those of us that have been around a little while, you may remember it as Riverside Mall. Suny Poly, or Suny IT, is located right here. Here's the main road in. And drive over here and come right up here, and right up in this area, they've put some new buildings, and right over here is where many of us got our COVID-19 shots, up here just to the north of this image. You can see the landforms, see the streets. You can see channels where water poured down through here. And notice, here's a pretty broad channel that drains out off the Adirondacks. And over here we have a smaller one, but it stops right here at the campus. There's a big one right here just off the campus, or actually running down to the west side of the campus. We're going to look at this little thing right here in detail in a little bit. What are we going to look for? Well, in a continental glacier, which this area was covered by vast continental glaciers, at maximum extent, it was about 3,000 feet thick here. In the Adirondacks, it was up over a mile, covered the top of Mount Marcy. We can have active or advancing ice lobes telling us that the accumulation is greater than the melting and the ice will advance or move. A stagnant ice lobe will be when the ice has an equilibrium between the amount of snow that's accumulating and the amount of ice that's melting. And then if the ice is retreating, the amount of melting is greater than the amount of movement or accumulation. As the ice melts, the water's got to go somewhere, and a huge amount of water melted out of that pile of ice that was around 3,000 feet thick here. Much of it drained out and traveled down to the south. Some of it pooled in proglacial lakes, and some of it flowed underneath the ice. You can see the piles of sediment in here, and here's a lot of glacial till, unlayered, unsorted sediment. Older till beneath that from previous glaciations from the Kansan, Nebraskan, and Illinoisan ice sheets that moved across the area. This last one was referred to as the Wisconsin. And there are till plains where meltwater gets deposited out of here. We'll find some layered deposits, and then we'll find piles of end moraines or recessional moraines that were left by the ice, which may represent a still stand or a re-advance of the ice. And these could be hundreds to thousands of years to accumulate. So we've got sediment down here, we've got ice here, and beneath the ice, there are specific landforms that form under the ice. These are one of the units that Colgan identified in an analysis using LiDAR. They did a statistical analysis of the sediments that were found and the landforms that were found beneath the ice. And they identified a number of different landforms depending on where they form in the ice. The till plains, till plain terrain, is sediment left, and it's generally mixed sediment, left either on top as the ice melted down or plastered to the bottom of it as the ice rode over something. So there's lodgement till or ablation till. Lodgement at the base, ablation as it melted and filtered down on top of the ground as the ice melted. A drumlin, a streamlined pile of sediment that indicates the direction of ice flow. And that is represented by the drumlin terrains. Stagnation terrains, hummocks, cames, piles of sediment, kettles, depressions left as ice blocks melted out and left a hollow. Dead ice sinks, again, depressions that are left by the blocks of stagnant ice. An esker, a sinuous ridge. And eskers are typically found near the outwash or the ice contact areas. Outwash deposits, this is the sediment that's dumped by the meltwater. And glacial lakes, all this water that gets trapped either at the ice margin or between ice margins or blocked by a landform like a moraine or the bedrock deposits that we find in the Appalachian Plateau or in the Adirondack Highlands. Now, what do I mean by the Erie, Ontario lowlands, the Adirondacks, and the Appalachian Plateau? These areas in red to the south of us, you look to the south, you can see a series of hills and ridges. Down here in the Rome area, our elevation is about 340, 350 feet. right near the canal. And where I live up here in the Appalachian Plateau, I'm at an elevation of about 1,300 to 1,400 feet. So there's a pretty good rise in elevation between Rome and the top of the Appalachian Plateau. If we head to the north and east, we run into the Adirondacks, which are still even higher elevations. If you get up around Deerfield and to the north of there and on up into the Tug Hill Plateau, we're looking at thousands of feet up to Mount Marcy at 5,000 feet. To identify some landforms that we'll be talking about, and this is on the 30-meter LiDAR image, the hillshade LiDAR image. If you go to New York State GIS Clearinghouse, look for the LiDAR ortho imagery, find the 30-meter image, and click on hillshade. You'll find this image right here. Here's Route 5. Here's the thruway coming up along through here and zipping down to the south side of Oneida Lake. Rome right here. Rome is on the Erie, Ontario lowlands. We're at a point where three major landforms meet. Erie, Ontario lowlands right here, the Adirondack highlands to the north, and the Appalachian Plateau to the south. And right here at Rome, actually right by Bellamy Park, is the point where the dividing line is between the drainage basin for the Mohawk River, for the Oneida Lake and Lake Ontario drainage basins. And then to the south of us, the Appalachian Plateau and the Valley Heads moraines mark the drainage divide between water that goes down to the Susquehanna and water that flows northward into either Oneida Lake or Lake Ontario. Over in the eastern part of the study area, there's a large drumlin field. You see all these little lumps and bumps that are all kind of oriented from right to left. That's the drumlin field, and you can see that on the 30-meter. We're going to look at it in a lot more detail. To the south, we have a bunch of north-south U-shaped valleys. And then here we have the area that we talk about as the Mohawk Valley. And we're going to cover mostly the western part of the Mohawk Valley between Utica and Rome. In the eastern part, over in Herkimer County, we have that series of drumlins, a pile of streamlined hill, almost spoon-shaped, sometimes referred to as whalebacks. If you've ever driven over toward to the west, past Syracuse on the New York State Thruway, just before you get to the area of the Montezuma Swamp, there's part of a large drumlin field. It's one of the largest in the world. There are over 10,000 drumlins in the central New York drumlin field. These drumlins in Herkimer County run east-west. The ice flow direction from the more blunt end to the more tapered end of these drumlins was from the east to the west. All of the ones over in the Lake Ontario drumlin field pretty much run north to south. So there's a very different direction of ice flow just to the east of us. To the west of us, everything was pretty much coming out of the north. Using ArcGIS, you can set up a three-dimensional image, and this is what a drumlin looks like. They can be a couple hundred yards long or a couple hundred meters long, or they may be kilometers or even a couple miles long. They generally range from tens to 50 feet in height. And again, this indicates the direction of ice flow. And you notice on this, I've colorized the image with the blues being the lower elevation, the yellows and then the reds being the higher elevation. What does the end of a glacier look like? Well, there aren't many of us that have had a chance to walk up and stand at the end of a glacier. It's a very, very interesting procedure to get that close to one. And my first impression was like opening a freezer door and standing in front of an open freezer and feeling the cold air come rushing at you. The cold air coming off the glacier is more dense and flows down off the ice. The ice absorbs the red wavelengths of light and only lets the blue come through. So you can see how blue the glacial ice is. This is the terminus, or the end, or the snout of the Mendenhall Glacier up in Juneau, Alaska. Right here, it's only about maybe 15 feet, 3 meters high. As you get farther out into the ice field, it's over 900 feet thick. There's a lot of sediment that's been dropped and left. This is glacial till. And there's some bedrock here that shows scratching and grooving on the surface. And I had a chance to climb down underneath that ice sheet and look at it from underneath. This thickness right here is about 1.5 meters or about 18 inches. Excuse me, about 1.5 feet or about 0.5 meter, about 18 inches. Here's the glacial till, this unsorted, unstratified sediment. It's all loose. You can just reach in and grab the mud and grab the pebbles. There's a little rock flower in here that makes this water that's been trapped down here grayish. Here's the bedrock that's scratched and grooved and has rock flour, just finely ground rock sticking to it. And here you can see the shape of some of the surface. Now there's some discussion as to how drumlins form. Were they formed by almost like a jello mold or a cookie press onto the sediment? Or was it formed by this ice moving over the top of it and dragging it out? I kind of lean toward the latter, but there's still a lot of study being done on how drumlins form. One thing you can notice in here, if you see these little kind of vertical lines coming down, that's water dripping down from the ice sheet. That was one of the things I was amazed. I expected to hear the glacier popping and cracking and making noise. About all I could hear when I was up on the ice in Juneau, Alaska, in '93, was water running. Just constant water running. And here at the end of the Ptarmigan Glacier, not far from the Mendenhall Glacier that we're just looking at, this is the recessional moraine. Terminal moraine or recessional moraine is a big pile of sediment with erratics, boulders. And here in central New York, you can find a lot of these large boulders sitting around that were left as the ice melted, and they were carrying these boulders and just dropped them on the surface. This is the ablation till and the formation of a moraine. The meltwater cuts through the moraines and pours out below the moraines, creating an outwash plain, like we saw in the sketch diagram earlier. And you can see these braided streams. Now, this is a pretty small glacier, but a bigger glacier has exactly the same landforms and exactly the same patterns forming on the surface with the meltwater. Dr. Ridge and a number of other scientists have been studying these moraines. And again, we have some radiocarbon dates, 23.2 to 19.5 on the maximum extent of the ice here in New York State. The valley heads, radiocarbon age dated with a little bit more precise dating than that first set of diagrams I showed you. And here we see 14.5 to 14.3 thousand years ago. 23,000, 14,000. The inner valley heads moraines, about 13,000. And then as we get farther to the north and the Rome advance, the Rome lobe of the ice at about 12.5 thousand years. And then farther up into Lake Ontario, 12.2 to 11.9. And by about 11,000 years ago, almost all the ice was out of New York State. Fairchild had 9 different positions of the ice that he showed. Today we know there's, in this diagram, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, at least 10, and possibly more. So we're getting a lot more detail by looking at things with new technology, the radiocarbon dates and LiDAR. A couple last things. Here's the Glacier Bay, one of the ice sheets at Glacier Bay National Park up in Glacier Bay, Alaska. And here's the sediment. This is more like the piles of moraines that we find here in central New York. So it's a much larger glacier. This is an active glacier, medial moraine down the middle, lateral moraines on the side, bedrock over here, and all this glacial till that gets dumped out. And this is what we find here in New York. Let's look at one from down in southern Oneida County near Riskview Falls at the head of Riskview Creek. The creek starts over here at the Valley Heads Moraines and flows to the north up through Deansboro. And in the LiDAR image, you can see some very interesting things. You can see roadways, you can see the old canals, you can see the railroad tracks or the railroad track beds. But here we have that lumpy, bumpy topography. This is all moraines, some of it underlain by a little bit of bedrock, but you can see the sediment, and this light blue line right here indicates the edge of that Valley Heads moraine at Riskview Falls. Here we can see on the Taku Glacier up in Alaska, that moraine, these lumpy, bumpy things we were just looking at, the glacial valley here, the meltwater channels coming through. If we jump back to the previous slide, here you can see the meltwater channels that have cut through the moraines, meltwater channel here, the moraines, the piles of sediment, and the terminus of the ice. And this was the valley that the ice was in, right up here in the northern part. Just to the south and west of the previous slide from Riskview Falls, we get into the area around Madison. Route 20 travels right down through here. The Riskview Creek flows northward. And here you can see the old Shenango Canal right in that area. The channel of the Riskview Creek and the railroad track and the Salisville Augusta Road here. Oops, Salisville Augusta Road right here. And you can see a large number of cames and kettles, flat terrace tops, kettles left by ice blocks. There's a little kettle lake right there. Here's a little kettle right here. If you've ever driven across Route 20 in front of the Madison School, this is the depression. Madison School is located right here under between the K and E of Kettle. And this winter, or any winter, you can generally see the children sledding in that little kettle right in front of the Madison School. There's another one headed up towards Salisville. There are a series of kettles and small kettle lakes and dead ice sinks. A dead ice sink would be a large area of a kettle formation. There's a number of kettles that have joined together where a big chunk of ice was left and later melted away. You can see Madison Lake, it is a dead ice sink in this sediment in the glacial till and the cames that form the Valley Heads moraines in the area around Madison and Salisville. Let's head a little farther north. As the ice retreated, some features formed on or under the ice. You can see the Rome sand plains. They were quite a bit later. But down here we have a kind of a really bizarre looking egg crate structure. Heard it referred to as that. You see these crossing almost perpendicular lines What are these things? Here's the Erie Canal, there's Route 46, Rome Sand Plains. What are these things? This is the 30-meter LiDAR. Oh, and notice you can see some meanders on Wood Creek on a very, very flat stretch on the Erie, Ontario lowlands. But what are these? Let's look at a modern glacier again, the Norris Glacier. You can see cracks in the ice. Ice moves like a stream. It flows. It flows very slowly. And we think of ice as being very brittle. But underneath, down on the bottom with great pressure, it acts like a metamorphic rock. And it flows, kind of like silly putty. Under low-term stress, it'll flow very easily. Under long-term or short-term stress, if you break it, it'll snap and crack. So we have the very, very slow, long-term stress beneath on the ice beneath the surface. And on the top, where it flows over rocks like a waterfall would, it creates an ice fall, and crevasses form in the ice. Not a crevice. A crevice is a little tiny crack in the ice or the rock. But a crevasse is a very, very large break in the ice. Here you can see some some 90-degree cracks in the ice and some longitudinal crevasses in the ice. So we have breaks that go parallel to the ice flow, like these up here, and some that go perpendicular to the ice flow. And when the ice melts, the sediment that's being carried in the medial moraines or in the lateral moraines along the side of the ice, that sediment or sediment that's trapped into it, the ablation till, will collect in those crevasses. Crevasse is a big opening, very large, could be hundreds of feet deep, could be multiple hundreds of feet deep, or it could be as small as maybe a dozen feet deep. Here we see some over in Madison County, a little bit to the south and west of here. These are some of the first that I ever saw. Here's an area called Pratts Hollow. It's a little bit north of Morrisville and south of Oneida. And on the 30-meter LiDAR images, you can see these ridges. Those are crevasse fillings. You can see them on the 30-meter map. And here is a crevasse up on the Ptarmigan Glacier up in Alaska. You can see how deep that goes down, and I've had the opportunity to rope up and climb down into these things. Each of these layers is an annual layer of snow and ice that's been compacted into fern or ice crystals. And then sediment will accumulate in here, forming very similar layers. And this is the sediment in a crevasse filling at Pratts Hollow here in upstate New York. So you can see the layers of ice here. These are layers of sediment that were washed into a crevasse like this. That's what these things are, south of the Rome Sand Plains, just north of Route 46 and the old Erie Canal. So you can see the crevasses that form trending east-west, and you can see some crevasses in here that trend north-south, just like we saw in the crevasses on the Norris Glacier. Here we see the underside of a glacier. This is climbing down into an ice cave underneath the head of the Lemon Glacier. And here's the thick, what we call old ice. It's been completely compressed and turned into solid, clear ice. The sunlight traveling down through it has the red light absorbed and only lets the blue light through. And here's the entrance to the cave, and snow and dirt have been blown into the center of it. Turning around from this position and walking down into the ice cave, we find a stream that carved out the cave, a layer of dirty ice from a higher level that froze, and then the water drained out of it. And here on the side, we have a moraine, a pile of sediment. And then here is the glacial ice over the top of the cave, and probably 15, 20 feet above that would be the ice surface. Where that stream was flowing underneath the ice, it could leave a pile of sediment. And when the sediment is left and the ice melts away, it can leave an esker, a streamlined, sinuous ridge of sediment, often referred to as hogsbacks. Here we have an esker, an end moraine. Here's the end or terminal moraine. Here's the esker. So this area indicates right near the ice margin, right near the edge of the ice. So you can see where the ice would have been, and now you can see the land as it appears today. Here's an esker that formed over near Whitestown, the Whitestown or Whitesboro esker. I think it was draining to the north and somewhat east. And this thing is about a mile long. It's about 12 to 15 feet high, so it's not a very big esker. But it indicates that this was an area underneath the ice in the late stages of glaciation. Talked about the different ice lobes a little while ago. Here's the Ontario lobe. Here's Rome. Here's Utica, both underneath the ice. The Mohawk lobe over here, and a glacial lake forming between the two. And we think there were a whole series of glacial lakes that formed in here, where the Mohawk lobe and the Ontario lobe or the Rome lobe met, then melted back. The water was dammed up by the Adirondacks to the north, by the Ontario lobe to the west, and later the Rome lobe, and then the Mohawk lobe to the east. And this one, Cedarville Lake, as it was described in the North American Glacial Varve project, they look at lake deposits and look at the yearly accumulation of sediments at the bottom of the lake. And the meltwater traveling out here, out the Bouckville Col, the area around Madison and Oriskany Falls, where we were looking at the sediments. And here we have the ice and the proglacial lake and the sediment that forms in here. And meltwater was flowing underneath this, very much like it did in the area around Utica and Rome when those two ice lobes were here. And subice and meltwater discharge was occurring underneath the lake, underneath the ice, into the lake, and underneath the water. Chunks of ice, growlers, icebergs, growlers being something that only sticks up about a meter. An iceberg, 5 meters. Let's see, this would be less than 3 feet. This would be about 15 feet. And somebody asked me how they got these names and what the size difference was. And I found out one other type of ice chunk that was in the lakes around here, bergy bits. And this is a bergy bit. It's bigger than a meter or 3 feet above the ice, but less than 15 feet above the ice. So iceberg, bergy bit, and a little tiny growler. So we have these icebergs, bergy bits, and growlers. This is a side view of what we think was happening in the area just north of Utica. And sediment was being deposited into these glacial lakes. And where Suny Poly is today, when they were digging for one of the buildings, I had the opportunity to see some of the sediment that was coming up. And it's all broken up lake sediments and glacial till that has been deposited underneath the ice. very much like we saw looking under the Mendenhall Glacier. Here we are at Suny Poly right here. Here is the Riverside Center. By colorizing the LiDAR data, the red stuff is the highest elevation, yellow is the intermediate elevation, and the pale blues are the lowest. This would have been the bottom of the glacial lake. Here's the near shore environment, probably where the ice was, right about here where the blue and green end. And the yellow areas right here were probably the beach areas. And if you go north of Riverside Center, this hill slope right here on the north side of BJ's is glacial lake clays, lake bottom sediments. The area up here is sand. The kids up there drive their four-wheelers all around here, and you can see that sand deposit. So here's the beach. Here's the bedrock and the glacial till that was plastered underneath the ice. The ice margin would have gone right through an area right about here, and right where that E is, you can see another esker. And now let's look at Rome. Here's the topographic map of Rome, an older topographic map, but you can see the flat areas here out by the mucklands. These mucklands were the bottom of Glacial Lake Iroquois. And the water drained to the east, leaving a shoreline right here in downtown Rome, not far from the Rome Historical Society. And as you go out of Rome and you head back up toward Stanwix, you go back uphill, you start heading up onto the beach terraces here and then on up into the Appalachian Plateau. Let's look at the LiDAR image, and you can see some pretty amazing detail in this. The red is the area left by the ice or the sediment underneath it, and it's piles of sediment or bedrock. The shoreline is roughly the yellow area here. And if you're driving along Route 365 and you see the tank farms, the big petroleum tanks down in Verona, they're built right on the shore of former Glacial Lake Iroquois. They're built on the sand deposits, so that if something leaks, they'll get absorbed by the sand. So the engineers knew a little bit about the glacial history of the area. You can see a lot of detail in the LiDAR images. Notice the outline of Fort Stanwix. You can also see the former line of the Mohawk River and the early canals that were dug. Two different versions of the early canals, the Clinton's Ditch and the widened canal, and then eventually the barge canal that was dug through here. Here's one of the canals going up. The Inland Lock Canal, the early Erie Canal, and now Barge Canal, and what's now named the Erie Canal. You see a lot of the roadways. There's a kind of a spit right here. It goes down, and the cemetery here in Rome is built on that spit of land. The spit's out here. And sand deposits in some of the areas along here going out Dominic Street. And here is the channelized Wood Creek. And right in this area, right about here, is where the dividing line is between the Mohawk Channel, the Mohawk Drainage Basin, and the Erie, Ontario Lowlands Drainage Basin. So this outlet and these shorelines were right here in this flat area, the peat deposits. That was the muckland from the former lake bottom. And here we see the lake at the end of the Mendenhall Glacier, and this would be the area down where the mucklands are. The outlet would be somewhere over here to the right where the stream drains out into the Mendenhall Creek. And you see these little lines right here formed by the waves. those are a series of shorelines. And as the lake rises or falls, it leaves strand lines here on the shore. And where Lake Iroquois was draining out through the Mohawk and down into Lake Albany, it left a series of strand lines or shorelines. And these lines are in the area just south of Oneida Lake, south of just west of the crevasse fillings that we were looking at earlier. And you can see these lines on the LiDAR images that are the former beaches of glacial Lake Iroquois. Once the lake drained out, it left these sand deposits, and the prevailing winds picked up those sand deposits and blew them into parabolic dunes. Gentle on the upwind side, where the saltating or bouncing grains rolled up the hill, and then boom, down the slip face of the dune. And if you go out to the Rome sand plains, you can walk across the top of some of these sand dunes and see this incredible field of dunes and walk along some of the trails. The DEC and the Nature Conservancy and a couple of other organizations have preserved these, and today there are some great hiking trails on both sides of Hogsback Road, named for these hogsbacks, not quite eskers, but similar shapes formed by the prevailing winds blowing the sand into dunes. So let's finish up and summarize. We started out in the southern area with the valley heads moraines, marking the one still stand of the ice or re-advance of the ice. The Drumlin field in Herkimer County to the east of here, indicating direction of ice flow from the east. And then as we moved back, the ice margin stopped at the top of the Appalachian Plateau, leaving this stranded meltwater channel. And then as the ice continued to retreat, it moved up into the valley, leaving an esker where the ice margin was in the Westmoreland area, in the Whitesboro area, just a little north of Westmoreland. And then the glacial shorelines up here where the ice from the Mohawk Lobe left the Mohawk Valley and retreated north of Utica, leaving the strand lines and the glacial lake sediments. And then the area over here where the crevasse fillings were, where the ice still was coming in on the Rome lobe. And then as the ice retreated farther and broke through on the Mohawk River channel, the Mohawk, we have the outlet at Rome at about 370 feet. And then the shoreline, the strand lines as the lake drained out through that channel. And then lastly, the wind blowing the sand dunes into the Rome sand plains, and a couple of really nice dead ice features up here also. I'd like to thank several people that had input with this. Barb and Dave Tewksbury were just fantastic in trying to help me with the understanding of LiDAR and collecting and analyzing the LiDAR images. My mentors, Dr. Donald B. Potter and Jay Fleischer. Jay took me up to Alaska for the Juneau Icefield Research Project, and folks of the National Park Service, both here and at Glacier Bay National Park, where I had a chance to see Glacier Bay and the melting of the ice up there. And if anybody's interested in following up a little bit more on this or knowing more about it, I would highly recommend the New York GIS Clearinghouse. You can do a search for that on Google and look for orthoimagery. New York State Museum, SED, Geological Survey, the New York State GIS Clearinghouse, orthoimagery, and you can look at things in LiDAR at a 30-meter level on your own. Thank you very much. I look forward to any questions that anybody has, and I'll turn it back over to Miranda and say thank you for joining us.
All right, yeah, thank you, Bob. That was a very interesting presentation. It's always a pleasure to learn from you. And, you know, I'll put your email address in here, so if people have any further questions about this, they can send them to you, if that's okay.
Yep, that's fine.
And I'll try to get a live link of the New York State GIS Clearinghouse too, so people can click it right here and investigate a little bit more. So,
Excellent.
Great. Thank you very much for everyone who was watching, and I hope you really enjoyed this program and learned something from it. Feel free to share this video, like it, and put your comments below so that we can hear your thoughts.
Thanks for hosting us.
All right, goodbye, everyone. Thank you again, Bob.